So for this, I apologize. They said everyone do 3-minute pictures, and I seem to be the only one who's compiled some slides. But my talk today was very, very serious. So I decided, if anyone's seen me talk before, I'm not too serious. So I decided to bring it way back. So my argument is object-oriented programming is great because object-oriented programming is for humans. Because let's face it, humans are a bit shit, aren't they? It's true. I mean, it really is true. Humans are shit. We're easily confused by things that computers just simply wouldn't be. And while I can't remember the complete works of Shakespeare, Keynote can casually scroll it across, animate it across, it can't animate it across the screen, clearly. Now, I warn you, if you ever do try this, turn spell check off first. But don't worry, the computers aren't taking over. Even the best state-of-the-art computers, AI, thinks this is a woman holding a baby giraffe in the zoo. So us humans, we like to write our software like this. This is just hello world in Java, and it's really quite elegant. That's the first and last time you'll ever hear me call Java elegant. But it's more elegant than what it compiles down to. So this is the bytecode that hello world demo compiles down to. And if we thought like computers, this is what we'd be writing. And if anyone can tell me what the fuck Cafe Babe is about, please find me at the pub later. So we have a complex application, and we're going to rationalize our problems as objects. So we have a person here, and they have a couple of static properties, name and gender. You could argue these aren't static, but a couple of dynamic properties like clothes their clothes and a job, and of course some actions like walking and saying things. And they can have associations to other objects, objects that inherit from other objects. So we've got a tuxedo that inherits from a suit, that inherits from clothes, and it has its own properties. But the real powerful thing about object-oriented programming is you can move around the context. You can reuse the objects in different situations. So given that the person has a job, they can have a uniform, which also associates to another clothes-type object. And you end up with lots of objects that are very complicated when put together. But as singletons, when you look at them on their own, they make complete sense, and they're really easy to understand. Whereas functional programming is a bit more like this. I mean, nobody knows what's going on here. Thank you.
Roger. Yep.
Okay. I have some notes, I'm afraid. Super non-professional. So, code reuse, encapsulation, developer decoupling. These are all things that we associate with object orientation. But actually, I think talking about them is the wrong thing to be doing right now, because that's not really the question that we've been asked. The question we've been asked is, was object orientation a mistake? Or was OO a mistake? But then that's one step further than I've gone. To which I respond, no, it wasn't. So object orientation and the pattern that it generates, the pattern it embodies, has enabled at least 2 or 3 generations of software developers. Virtually everybody in this room at some point in their academic life will have learned how to program using object orientation. That's an extraordinary thing for a programming paradigm to have done. The next thing is, it saved us from a world of procedural code in the 1970s. If anybody here has programmed any COBOL or Fortran, you'll fundamentally understand why object orientation was a good thing. And back in 1980, when C++ was first developed, the only alternative was like a weird academic version of ML, which nobody without a degree in lambda calculus could care about, or Lisp, which arguably, I imagine the fight will go that way. So on top of that, the most important thing to me is that, was OO a mistake? Well, actually, No, it wasn't. And the reason that it wasn't is because it facilitated the development of every piece of software, or virtually every piece of software, that control and make the world around us right now. Every single thing that you use, everything that you interact with, the internet, etc., is built on object-oriented language. Fundamentally, C++ has generated trillions and trillions of dollars of value and has raised some of the poorest people in the world out of poverty. How could it be possible? How could it be possible that any paradigm which has fundamentally rebuilt the world that we live in be a mistake? I rest my case. Mic drop.
Thank you, Roger. So, who's going first from the yes, it was a mistake camp? Okay, is Roger to make some mistakes?
Right. Is this working? Yes, it is. So, was object orientation a mistake? Well, maybe would be my answer. Clearly, some of the things that the other Roger has said are true. I've seen the impact that object-oriented programming's had on some difficult systems. There was a big CAD system that I saw being built, and when somebody turned up who'd studied Simula 67, had a huge impact on it. Mind you, they weren't using an object-oriented language. They were inheriting, as it were, some of the ideas of object orientation into their system. That system made a huge step forward again when they introduced garbage collection, which has nothing to do with object orientation. And one could argue about which one actually had the greater impact. So I think as a concept, whatever that might be, we need to be careful about that, it was probably a good thing. But it became a bit of a religion. Everything had to be object-oriented. Everything had to be treated as an object. And I think that led to a lot of problems. In particular, as some of you will know, I have a strong background in parallel and concurrent programming, and people could not understand the difference between message passing and messaging objects. And the centralization that's pretty inherent in the object-oriented style, the fact that you do have a lot of mutable shared state, is definitely a bad thing. So I think it probably caused concurrency and techniques for dealing with concurrency to grow slower than it might have done. I also think that the wars that went on between object orientation and functional programming were bad, and I think it's caused people to ignore the fact that functional programming is really transformed and is now, comprehensible to mortals sometimes, and can be very efficient, which it didn't used to be. So finally, I think the other problem is that if you have an object-oriented hammer, you see everything as an object-oriented nail, and actually the world's a bit more diverse than that. So I think on balance, it's been a bad thing.
Okay, so back to the question, was OO a mistake? How could we possibly have something that's so ubiquitous as OO as a mistake and everybody probably in this room using it? But we have, all of you are probably using one of the biggest mistakes in software now, a multi-billion-dollar mistake called null. So it is actually very possible that a lot of what we use in computer science is a huge mistake and very expensive. So some things that came around at the same time as what we call modern OO programming with Java and C#, like garbage collection, like fancy IDEs, they were great, but they're nothing to do with OO. And they work in functional, they work in procedural. And what we have here is a conflation between useful things like GC with OO itself. So let's take some of the OO concepts like inheritance. Now, if you read the literature, you shouldn't be using it, but everything you see is about how to use inheritance. I actually met somebody down the pub recently who's one of the main providers of software to veterinary surgeries, which is the canonical example of inheritance, dogs, cats. Apparently, he has seen pretty much all veterinary surgery software. Nobody uses inheritance for animals. I'm sorry, it's a mistake. It doesn't exist. And when you look at it, you've got the other canonical example is graphical libraries. And I work in graphical libraries. There are 9 levels of inheritance in a button in .NET. And there's over 160 members. They've had to patch up IntelliSense with a sort of AI algorithm so you can actually find the thing you're looking for in that mess of inheritance. What we have is a huge success for OO with vendors trying to put band-aids over the IDE to try and make this thing useful. We've got huge coupling in the software, huge levels of dependencies, making it a large numbers of people I speak to not being productive whatsoever in OO languages. It is a huge mistake. It's costing our industry huge amounts of money. Thank you.
Okay, so what we're going to do, that was loud. What we're going to do now is open it up to the floor. So if you've got any observations you'd like to make or any questions you'd like to ask, please keep them short and to the point so we can get through as many as possible. There's a couple of microphones roving around. Please wait for a microphone. And go to the link provided and vote the way that you currently feel. And you can change your vote. Right, so without further ado, anybody got any questions?
Well, no, I was just like, it's always ending like about is a Java, but we're talking about garbage collector. Probably you're right, but of course C++, multi-inheritance, I would say really convenient. Actually, most of the people was complaining about the time when it was about Java. Why do we have the bloody interface when we can have multiple inheritance? I find really useful. One of the best package from Java, I would say, is Swing. Actually, you mentioned the UI side from C#. I'll bring the Swing one. I think it's one of the best package of projects, let's say, from Sun, no Oracle, unfortunately. But
is there a question or an observation?
no, it's an observation. Sorry. So no, I would like to understand. I would like to understand what is the alternative, because I don't need to go back to the 70. I can go. Actually, I was just 3 years old in 70.
Okay, let's take what was the alternative.
What's the alternative? I mean,
right.
I remember about BASIC or was just C or whatever. You can even write procedural code in Java if you want. But what is the alternative about that?
I'd love to answer that question. Yeah. Again, I think there's a conflation. Huge standard libraries that come with Go, with Java, with .NET, they're great. Yeah, you don't have to deal with where is this thing? How do I write to a file? So standard libraries are cool, but they don't have to be OO. They don't have to use 9 layers of inheritance. It can be done with composition, right? And functional procedural languages like Go actually do have huge standard libraries without inheritance, without that mess. So I agree, standard libraries are a good thing, right? But they don't have to be OO. And having to fix IntelliSense to deal with the inheritance problem, that seems a bit comical. So, do you not feel that answers your question?
No, because about libraries when instead
I'm going to have to cut you off there because we've got lots of people who want to speak. Does anybody from the no camp want to?
So I won't specifically talk to the gentleman's response, but I will talk to yours. So I don't believe that OO precludes bad programming, and I don't believe that OO precludes bad implementations. What I would say is if you follow Alan Kay's original philosophy, and if you follow the fundamentals of object orientation, then there is nothing that is a mistake about OO. There is simply a paradigm which can be used to solve complex problems. Yet there is an argument that you could very easily make that programmers who program in functional languages are typically better, but I would suggest that that has a lot to do with the incredible complexity and difficulty in adopting a functional language precludes it from most people, and therefore it self-filters. So the reason that OO is a good thing is that it makes available programming to everybody, which I think is the point. I'd hate to live in a world where only the high priests could form and modify that world.
Thank you very much. Do we take another question?
So my nine-year-old's been programming in functional since he was 8. So I'm not sure. You like trying to put the high priests of functional, potentially the high priests of math, maybe, but try and explain protected private internal to your 8-year-old and see what happens there.
Okay.
Again, don't use bad implementations.
Let's take a question.
I was just going to ask about JavaScript, because some would say that JavaScript's a functional language, it's got first-class functions, but it's also got objects, prototypical inheritance. It was a question, I guess, for the no side, who are saying that functional languages are archaic, esoteric things that only geniuses can understand. I think a lot of people write JavaScript. What do you say to that?
I'm going to kill our side now. Most JavaScript that I write, despite it being object-oriented language, I don't write object-oriented code. I write in a very functional way. Anything larger than that, I tend to use Ruby because I think their implementation of it is simply better. So it's not necessarily the implementation derives what you can do with it, essentially. So yeah, I don't think JavaScript's an excellent object-oriented language.
So I have a little bit of an addition to that. So if you look at all the JavaScript in the world, which I haven't done, so I'm making a gesture here. But if you look at lots of JavaScript, one, it is not written functionally by any means. It's largely written in a weird kind of encapsulate all the logic in functions, but make it look like objects, but kind of not. In fact, there's a pattern, I think it's called the enterprise JavaScript pattern. It's baffling. But so one typical JavaScript is not written functionally. And also, a lot of JavaScript is really bad. You know, I don't know about most people, and I told a bit of a hilarious joke, hilarious in a computing way this morning. My colleague here runs the Bristol JS thing, and they just hit 700 members. And I said, it's amazing that 700 people know what jQuery is. You know, that's the level of JavaScript that most people know, yeah? So, yeah, it's complicated.
Going back to what I was saying, I think when I do write object-oriented JavaScript, I tend to use CoffeeScript, actually. It makes it a better, more suitable language for it. But ES6 is introducing a lot of tools that can really help us write object-oriented JavaScript right.
Okay. Do you want to pass the microphone over to the yes camp?
Not
What
really.
they have to say?
Well, I'm speechless at some of this discussion, and I'm very pleased to hear that even more things are being added to these already bloated languages.
I think the I'm going to lessen some of what I've said before. I wanted to make a point. I think the real problem here is the purity, right? So you mentioned that there's some object features in JavaScript along with functional features, and it is pretty much the ubiquitous language of the web now, the most heavily used language, and I expect to see Node gain more and more ground. C#, Java was sold as pure OO languages. That's where I think the mistake is. I think we're at a Polyglot conference. Most of us would agree that setting out your stock as pure OO was a mistake, and forcing everybody to do pure OO and ignoring procedural and functional where it's appropriate. And what we're actually seeing, and I think I'm trying to use facts here, if you look at Java and C#, they're actually now not pure OO languages. All of the languages now have procedural and functional elements. And it's a done deal. It's considered, even by the language designers, to be a mistake, right? Because they've given up on pure OO, and they're doing multi-paradigm languages. Case closed.
Okay. Got any more
That
questions?
was not a fact.
I'd like to start by expressing my surprise that somebody cited the swing libraries as a positive example for object-oriented code, because I'd argue it's a negative. Key one being, who understands the thread safety semantics of the swing libraries? Nobody puts their hands up, because if they did, they'd be lying. But the problem is that the alternative is just an unrecognizable mass called a functional programming system that you can't handle either. And the problem is just complexity of modern systems, I think, means we're in trouble no matter what paradigm you're using.
Was that a question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's what is best at handling the complexity of modern systems, given that all strategies seem to suck?
Anybody? Yeah. Oh, this is going to be F sharp.
Well, we've had talks today on microservices, and I don't see that as a silver bullet, but I think one of the things that is making these systems particularly complex is the building of huge monoliths with shared mutable state. So we've got errors coming out with null reference exceptions, deadlocks, general concurrency, corruption. So the answer to building stable systems and is what's being seen by some of the big players in the industry is to build modular systems with small services, with safe communication channels between those without using shared mutable state, with declarative languages where you can actually understand the business data, with declarative logic, procedural, functional, where you can reason about your code, and types. And I think we are seeing an improvement when people adopt those systems. But unfortunately, and again back to the mistake, we've got 20 years from 1995 to 2015 of OO, pure OO, huge monolith systems with shared mutable state with an incorrect, poor threading model that we'll be supporting for the next 30 years. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So fundamentally, I agree. Yeah. I mean, because he's just talked about OO. Just one, yeah. Just one level of abstraction different. Yeah. So object orientation versus kind of microservice. Let's talk about that. So a microservice is a separate process that takes some input from some messaging system, might be HTTP or whatever, and reacts to that. That's OO. That's what OO was always meant to be. This encapsulated object which had some set of methods, some set of procedures within it that acted on an internal state. Now, the only difference really is the layer of abstraction, in my view. Now, obviously, that's a generalization, but that was the fundamental and continues to be the fundamental. Yeah, I mean, selling Java as pure OO is ridiculous. Some of the base types are not objects. Selling C# as OO was equally so, for the same reasons. But again, I fundamentally don't believe that the implementations of these things should be the only thing that we look at. Underneath it all, the paradigm, the concept, the architecture, if you expand it to that next level, is a good one. Separate your concerns. follow your solid principles, single roles for individual objects, make sure things communicate in a decoupled way. These are all positive, high-quality things to do. And so when building big systems that are incredibly complicated, I would probably still advocate for the same thing, apart from those people who were in the room when I did my talk earlier. So use a log, put a log in the middle of it. But other than that, yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally a good thing. Just stop. Stop.
Okay, any more questions? There's one in the middle there.
I guess I was going to say, I wonder if this question relates to the type of software we built in different times in the past. So maybe in the 80s, desktop machines, isolated, single processor. But now things have moved on and things are more distributed and we got the internet. And maybe that's part of what this question is and why people have changed their mind with regard to OO.
Give this to the yes camp.
Well, I'll take an opportunity to get a word in before passing it over. I think there's an issue of scale here. The type of, I think you have a good point, the type of programming that was done in the 80s, the scale of it was quite limited. And I think one of the issues is that it's not clear to me that the types of abstraction you want to build want to be continuous. You don't want to go from your assignment statement up to your 1,000 processor program in a sort of continuous lump. So you want to put some barriers in, be they microservices, processes, objects, or whatever you care to call them. I think it's a big problem to see the thing as a continuous stack that you can cut at any point. You need to make some decisions about it. And this is particularly true of these systems that are supposed to keep running whilst you change the software running on them. I mean, that's a concept that just wasn't there. So I think there is a problem of scale, and the scale of the systems we're building are completely different from what were being built 20 years ago.
I'll just contradict that. No, in the web, in the enterprise, I think you're right. We're seeing more concurrency, and so you want different ways to deal with that. People are moving to things like Erlang, Go, Scala, F#, so they've got a more reasonable concurrency model. But there are other areas. My background's in video games, and OO is just an absolute disaster for performance. It completely ruins your cache. You actually want to be able to see your data separate from your program, and so it's always been a problem in that area. You want to actually keep things on cache lines. Encapsulating them in objects is a terrible idea. And it's not necessarily merging two things doesn't feel like encapsulation. It just feels like shoving data in with functions because I don't know. Anyway, it's always been bad. Okay.
In response to what you were saying about performance, I'd actually not disagree with you in terms of game design, where you've got a host that the user is in control of. But I think that having an elegant programming structure is more important than performance. And the reason for that is you can throw metal at it. Employees are more expensive than hardware. So having something that somebody can easily understand, easily work with, easily mutate is more beneficial, in my opinion.
Great. Another question in the middle on the other side.
Hi there. I used to have a problem, but then I learned Java, and I ended up with a public abstract strategy problem factory, which was much better. My assertion is that almost a cottage industry of kind of fixes and strategies and approaches is built up around the essential limitations of object-oriented programming. So you talk about things like solid principles. These seem to be selectively applied. I mean, when was the last time anyone used the Liskov substitution principle when writing OO code? So the kind of constant reassertion that object orientation is simpler, can you kind of marry those two things together?
Okay, so yeah. So again, I come back to this So I take your straw man with your straw man factory, which is an abstract, and I respond with a straw man argument. So that is again that terrible programmers will program terribly in any paradigm you throw at them. And if you are choosing as selecting your paradigm for programming in order to restrict terrible programmers, then what you probably want to do is get them all to write proof-carrying code, because then at least you can run it through a logic system and say that it works or does not. That would be my kind of anti for that. As for, do people really follow solid principles? I think it all comes back down to this pragmatism thing. Is OO perfect? Of course not. It is a method of solving a problem. There are other methods. Some of them require lambda calculus. Some of them don't. What I would say is that I would personally prefer to teach young people how to develop software using conversations that I could relate to the real world. And to which they could have a real-world understanding of, and therefore it is an enabler. Is it the best programming dynamic in the end? If it's programmed terribly, no. But then, you haven't seen my functional programming. I mean, you really, really haven't. It's terrible. You can write bad code. So yeah, does that answer your question, or very weakly? I'll take pretty good. Do you guys want to beat me up on that? Yeah.
Sorry. the idea of terrible programmers not being able to do OO just seems a little. I don't think that exists. If you look at the examples of class names you've come up with, you see that kind of thing from Facebook, from Google, from Microsoft. You see those in those code bases. Those are arguably have gone through the most stringent hiring procedures, and are at the top of the industry, and they can't do it without resorting to an abstract proxy bean factory singleton. And so what hope is there for the rest of us? This isn't terrible programs. This is our best programs.
I feel like I want to answer more, but go.
Your previous argument of performance, and I said employees are more expensive than metal, not at Facebook.
Okay, another question. No more questions? Observations?
We're winning.
You are winning. There is one. The questions are good. They take longer.
Should we stop teaching OO at universities then? Should there only be one model that is taught?
I think when I was at university, we learned functional first. That was in the UK. There seemed to be a shift towards pushing people into everybody through Java and not having so much diversity in languages. I think functional programming, procedural programming, concurrent programming aren't particularly hard. Well, I teach programming, and I find it's very easy for somebody who hasn't done programming before to understand those. The problem is if you've been exposed to Java or C#, and then you have to unlearn. You have to spend a lot of time unlearning everything you learn before you can actually do it. And that's the real problem. Unlearning for us humans is harder than learning. And so the concepts aren't fundamentally hard. It would be great if either they added an unlearning Java course for a whole semester, or they just start with procedural and functional and then hurt them later with OO. That's my experience from working with people.
Of course not. Of course we shouldn't stop teaching people OO. But at the same time, you shouldn't stop teaching them everything, yeah? I mean, university is there to experience lots of things, not least, alcoholism. But, the idea of being part of an institution is to expand your mind. This would be an incredibly boring debate if we didn't have either of these things. And actually, I think programming in general would be a boring thing if we weren't each taking interesting learnings from the other side. Yeah, C# has improved exponentially since taking some functional requirements on, and F# would be OCaml if it didn't have objects. Yeah, probably not quite right, but very close. Sorry, that was terrible. But the cross-pollination is really important, and for education, cross-pollination is the only thing that's interesting, I think.
Can I jump in and defend OCaml? OCaml had GC, and it had objects and classes in 1995, like Java. So it was quite innovative there. And we're talking about multi-paradigm languages earlier. What I find interesting is that OCaml has this OO and functional link up. What you find is, and Java and C# are now getting the two, what you find is OCaml programmers will use 95% of their code will be functional, procedural, and they will use OO concepts, but for 5% of their code, because given the choice between the two, it's not that useful. It's useful, but it isn't the 95% that is the other way around. And probably if you look at your own C# and Java code, C# code particularly, because it's had link longer, a lot of your stuff will be link-based and lambdas now. Same with JavaScript. Probably most of your code is more functional than it is OO. So again, sorry.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question. So let me just see, is there anybody else that hasn't already asked a question that would like to ask something? Okay.
Don't you believe that in the 80s maybe the OO paradigm was really the right solution? I don't want to say now, but at least in the 80s and at the end of the 90s, a solution for all the programming coming from the banking system, all the stuff written in COBOL, VCL, all dirty Visual Basic, it was a big crap. Visual C++ at that time was the same shit. And all the programming done in just C was not a solution, actually, at least at that time, the OO for the kind of big procedural project that were absolutely impossible to maintain.
Yeah, around, I think Java was in the right place at the right time to become pop. Yeah, okay, Java, Smalltalk. Well, Smalltalk was actually closer to what the envision of OO was. And it was quite nice. Java was in the right place at the right time. There was a really nice movement we were moving towards declarative programming and 4GLs in the late 90s. And actually things were looking really sweet and up. And people were being really productive. And then what came along was the internet. And basically none of the 4GLs were ready for the internet. And Java was there, and people started building EJBs. And so it was just, in terms of pickup, it was in the right place at the right time. It was actually supposed, the irony is, it was supposed to be a web browser plugin, and it's just being used because of the cross-platform element. So in effect, we've gone from 4GL languages in the early 90s, being bombed back to writing imperative code for the last 20 years. with some classes tagged on it. Apart from that.
So I'm going to pick up on one comment that was just made. Smalltalk was quite nice. That's pretty big from the other side there. Because actually, I kind of agree. Yeah. So Smalltalk was probably the most honest representation of object-oriented languages. And so, you know, if the one thing that comes out of this conversation is that, you know, OO was not a mistake, but actually some of the implementations of OO were not optimal, then I think that's a win for us, yeah? I think that's just a win, just a win. And if you vote for the win, that's brilliant, thanks. Oh.
So I've heard this argument one too many times. It does sound to me a bit like communism's wonderful, it's just it's never been tried properly.
Wow. I'm not a communist.
Okay, so I think we're at our limit for time. So I'm going to give the teams, or each of the panelists, 1 minute to give their summing up thoughts, try and convince you that their way is the right way. So it's only fair, I think, that as the no's started, the yeses should be allowed to finish. So if we could start with the no's. Oh, that's this side.
Oh,
yeah.
right.
So you get to finish off.
Something we didn't really touch on in this debate was inheritance. And I think... What? I think inheritance is a really useful tool that is undervalued and something that can't really be replicated in functional programming. I'm getting it wrong. And I was born in the late 80s, so I don't know what's going on anyway. I think inheritance allows us to abstract the differences between what we inherit from in isolation. They allow us to look at problems that are very specific to the inherited object's domain. And that's really beneficial. 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Okay, so I'm going to close with kind of almost the same thing as I started with, and it's to kind of review the question. So, was OO a mistake? And to me, no, OO wasn't. I think every person in this room, again, you know, is here probably because they fell in love with a programming language when they were at university or at school, or, you know, reading a book. I would probably put money on a good 90% of you guys would have fallen in love with an OO language. You will have built most of the software you've ever built with those OO languages. And fundamentally, the majority of software ever written is with OO. So to call it a mistake would be a misnomer. What I do think is that the best thing that can ever happen is that the convergence of languages towards domains, where if a paradigm fits a particular way of developing, then it is the right thing to do. And OO is not always that thing, but that does not make it a mistake.
So I think... So, as I said, I'm very dubious that this software was written by Adam, actually. But well, I think we've heard a lot of arguments, and there's not a lot to add to them, except of course our arguments were much stronger than the other sides. I do think that the multi-paradigm world is important. Personally, I really dislike the idea of these languages which have every feature under the sun. I think they become part of the problem rather than part of the solution because the poor programmer doesn't know how to use them. Whether there's a solution around that will solve everything, I kind of doubt, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, you know, every implementation of an object-oriented programming language being slightly dodgy does make one wonder about the concept.
Thank you.
Okay, just countering the first two arguments, most of the code in production is COBOL, C. If we look at the web, it's PHP and JavaScript, so it's not OO, sorry. The inheritance thing, yes, functional languages use algebraic types, union types, and pattern matching, which achieve the same thing. So it's not unique to OO. I think OO as classes has some use, so it's not a mistake as a concept. The argument we've tried to make is that OO, pure OO, as the only one and true way of doing things for the last 20 years was a mistake, and I think it'd be kind of hard to disagree. Thank you.
Well, so that's... I think at the close of time, yes, it was a mistake, was actually winning, but it does seem to have cycled back to no, it wasn't. So the answer is we can't decide.